The Europe Association, EU, has coordinated a Brexit latency before the end of October, and preparations include begun to get portion in the Europe elections on May 23. Main Secretary Theresa May says if a transactions gets via Parliament up how day, the UK will not take part. But it seems potential how the UK will yet be in the EU at how spot. The Europe Parliament is immediately selected by EU voters. It is accountable, in the Justice of Ministers of Term State, for manufacturing laws and appreciative budgets. It as well acting a part in the EU's relations in some countries, consisting those willing to accede the bloc. Its members present the interests of various countries and various regions during the EU. Each 5-year, EU countries go to the polls to choose members of the Europe Parliament, MEPs. Every nation is posted a set quantity of seats, approximately depending on the amount of its people. The least, Malta, people, about part a millionth, has 6 members meeting in the Europe Parliament time. The greatest, Germany, people, 82 millionth, has 96. At the time down there are 751 MEPs in full and the UK has 73. Candidates can stay as individuals or they can stay as representatives of one of the UK's policy parties. One day selected, they present various regions of the nation, once again on to people. The polar east of England and Northern Ireland include 3 MEPs every time. The southward east of England, consisting London, has 18. Time largest UK MEPs are as well members of a domestic side. One day in the Europe Parliament they sit in one of 8 policy groups that involve MEPs of through the EU who stake the identical policy accession. Term state can run elections to the Europe Parliament onto their own domestic laws and mores, but they must adhere to several overall rules. MEPs must be selected with a framework of proportionate presentation, so, for sample, a side that reached a tertiary of the votes wins a tertiary of the seats. Strike in the UK for Europe Parliament elections is low both by EU standards and by the standards of some UK elections. The recent period they were detained in 2014, 36% of those acceptable to voice did so, compared in 43% in the EU as a entire. How compares in 66% strike at the next year's general poll. In 2016, 56% of the constituency elect in the Scotch Parliament elections, 45% in the Welsh gathering and 54% in the Northern Ireland gathering. In regional elections in England, strike varies depending substantially on which some elections are take location on the identical date, occasionally immersion as low as the Europe elections strike and occasionally growing shut to the standard of general elections. The recent period Europe elections were detained in 2014, the UK consumable £109 metre on them. The major expenses were fleeing the survey by itself, providing voting stations and venues to run counts, and mailing list out applicant data and voting cards. The government has told how if the UK does not end up part in the 2019 elections, it will compensate regional back commanders, the human beings accountable for fleeing elections, for any cost already pay. The EU is planner to bring the common quantity of seats in the Parliament of 751 to 705 while the UK foliage. Down there will be a redistribution of 27 of the UK's seats to 14 some term state how are now underrepresented. And the otherwise will be set towards in the opportunity of creature posted to any new term state how accede in the next. The EU has already gone law to do but it does not get impact before the UK foliage. The quantity of seats is covered in law at 751. The Europe Committee had informed how as length as the UK done a judgment to get portion in the Europe elections by medium April, the redistribution would be reversed. But which if the UK elects MEPs and later passes a transactions to keep the EU. In how instance, the UK MEPs would not get their seats, outgoing vacancies. The building of House of Commons Public Library says how additional MEPs could potential be selected on stay by in several term state but not get up their seats before the UK foliage the EU.